mpaka Ijumaa, moja kwa moja kutoka VOA Swahili, Washington.
Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Yuat. It's Monday, November 7th. This is Africa 54.
With the UN COP27 climate conference underway in Egypt, African nations are highlighting the impact they are suffering and asking rich nations to help fund remediation. Tanzania mourns the 19 deaths suffered Sunday from a Lake Victoria plane crash authorities are blaming on bad weather. With the U.S. midterm elections already underway and culminating tomorrow, election integrity has become a strong focus by all sides, and already some are crying foul. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
The United Nations Climate Conference is underway in Egypt, and climate experts and those involved in negotiations have outlined their aspirations for COP27. Africa, meanwhile, is struggling to respond to worsening weather extremes. VOA's Paul Ndiho has more.
More than 30,000 delegates, including representatives from 200 countries, are gathering for COP27 to discuss in detail ways to slow climate change and help those already feeling its impact. A group of young climate campaigners from Africa and France met with French President Emmanuel Macron on the sidelines of COP27 summit in Egypt.
So I wanted to be able to hear you out. You tell me what is important for you, if you have any questions, but also your messages.
During Macron's discussion with the youth, a Gabonese entrepreneur who runs a food production and distribution farm stressed the importance of this conference.
You know very well that Africa faces a real challenge in food sovereignty and especially food security. The agriculture sector is really vulnerable to climate change. Mr. President, desertification is worsening in certain regions, flooding in other regions, rising temperature, etc. And you probably know also that it's a sector essentially held by women in the rural areas. And so the challenge now is to be able to help these women to produce better, produce well, and especially to be resilient to climate change.
Seni Nafo is the coordinator of the Africa Adaptation Initiative, which seeks to strengthen climate change collaboration and adaptation across the continent.
When COPs move into the South, and especially in Africa, we're interested in concrete action. We want to see concrete action. We want to see enhanced action on the ground. So the first element to us is not to have more commitments, but to have transparency, accountability.
Hyphen Njitega, coordinator of the Loss and Damage Collaboration, is working to ensure that the people living in developing countries have the needed support to address climate change and related loss and damage.
We are hopeful that this COP is going to bring a change. There are some successful COPs happened previously, so we are now thinking that even this one, since we call it COP implementation COP, we are hoping that it will also be a successful one.
Ugandan youth activist Nyombi Morris arrived in Egypt for the COP27 climate summit with high hopes of being part of the campaign for environmental justice.
I was so happy when they announced that COP will be in Africa, and I thought maybe we'll get a chance to be at the room where the negotiations are taking place. But today I can tell you I wasn't allowed to access the room. And so I'm like, why are we here? Are we here to write around, or we are here for negotiations? So my worry is, even in Africa today, the COP is in Africa, but we have not been given a chance to speak. This is the one.
Analysts say Africa is home to some of the countries listed responsible for the planet heating emissions, but hardest hit by the onslaught of weather extremes. COP27 negotiation follows a year of wild weather disruptions worldwide, and Africa continues to suffer through deadly floods, storms, and drought. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
As we've mentioned, COP27 is underway in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, as officials strive to help the people most devastated by climate change. Farmers not far from the conference discussions say help cannot come fast enough. VOA's Heather Murdoch reports from Istanbul.
When Hudda Saad was a child here in Egypt's Nile Delta, the weather was moderate, and crops fetched prices high enough to make a comfortable living.
Now the weather is hellish. In the daytime it is hot, and at night it is freezing. The plants are pinched by this weather. It is not good. This is the problem with farming now.
The Nile Delta is Egypt's most important farming area. It is already suffering from rising seawater, robbing locals of valuable land. And as the UN climate conference, known as COP27, opened in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt on Sunday, leaders said they planned to focus efforts on getting funding in place to help people cope with extreme weather in the world's hardest-hit places, which have seen unprecedented fires, floods, and storms this year.
I particularly welcome the agreement of the parties to include a new agenda item on funding arrangements to respond to loss and damage.
Leaders are expected to disagree on if or how rich nations should compensate poor countries for climate disasters. Officials say the talks' most critical goal is implementing the plans made in the 2015 Paris Agreement, which aims to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And although the rule book for how to do this has been established, according to delegates, most countries have not put forward comprehensive plans. The UN says now, more than ever, the consequences of inaction could be devastating, with deadly heat waves, rapidly rising seas, and melting glaciers threatening lives and livelihoods on every continent. For some people, it may be possible to adapt to new weather, says Saad in the Nile Delta, but not without resources.
If the weather is beautiful, you will get nice crops, but if it's like this, the plants are ruined, and you can't find something to sell.
Saad says other world crises are deepening the strain caused by climate change for poor families, like high prices on fertilizer and currency devaluation. Heather Murdoch, VOA News, Istanbul.
French air accident investigators are deploying to Tanzania to assist in the investigation of a passenger plane crash which killed at least 19 people on Sunday. Technical advisors from the Franco-Italian plane maker which built the turboprop plane are accompanying the investigators to the scene. Diane To reports.
At least 19 people died when a passenger plane crashed into Lake Victoria in North Tanzania on Sunday while trying to land at a nearby airport. That's according to authorities, who gave the revised number after just 3 deaths were reported earlier. Flight PW494, operated by Precision Air, hit the water during storms and heavy rain. The wreckage could be seen almost fully submerged as rescuers in boats rushed to pull out trapped passengers. This rescuer said water surged in after the emergency door was opened, making it difficult for people to escape the plane. Prime Minister Kassim Majaliwa visited the crash site and said authorities were trying to figure out who was missing from the list of passenger names. Precision Air said the plane was carrying 39 passengers, including an infant, as well as 4 crew members. The 2 pilots initially survived the crash and were in touch with rescue workers from the cockpit, authorities said, but they later reported their oxygen supply was dwindling and had died by the time rescuers reached them. The 2 flight attendants survived. CEO Patrick Wanry said the airline has set up family assistance centers to provide information and will continue to offer support to the victims and their families. Tanzania's largest privately owned airline said in a statement the plane left the commercial capital Dar es Salaam and crash-landed just before 9 a.m. local time Sunday as it was approaching Bukoba Airport.
Diane To of Reuters filed that report. The Ethiopian government and Tigrayan forces have established a telephone hotline following last week's peace agreement. Meanwhile, representatives of Ethiopia's government and forces from Tigray are meeting in Kenya Monday to discuss how to begin implementing the ceasefire, with the talks in Nairobi expected to last 3 or 4 days. An official familiar with the talks says the hotline will address any flare-ups in fighting and coordinate disengagements with both sides, recognizing the challenge of fully communicating with all their units to stop fighting. Tuesday's midterm elections in the United States will determine whether Democrats maintain majorities or if Republicans seize power in the House of Representatives and the Senate, both of which are up for grabs. With some Republicans already crying foul on so-called election integrity, non-partisan groups are keeping a close eye on the process. VOA's Arasha Basadi has more.
Tuesday's general election will mark the end of early and in-person ballot casting in the 2022 midterm elections. Democrats currently hold thin margins in Congress, but if history is any indicator, President Joe Biden's party could lose dozens of seats in the House of Representatives and a handful in the Senate, enough to flip control of Congress for the Republican Party. Democrats say the Supreme Court ruling earlier this year overturning a woman's right to an abortion will drive voters to the polls despite rising inflation hurting ordinary Americans.
And even though our economy is tough, people think about it and say, wait a minute, this is the party trying to protect unions. This is the party that made sure we did things to lower prescription drug costs and lower health care costs. That this is the party, at the end of the day, that's trying to protect fundamental freedoms like the right to control your own body. So I think that this is a tough election season. It's a midterm election, but I still see a pathway for us to maintain control of the Senate.
Some Republican candidates have made election integrity a cornerstone of their campaigns, clinging to former President Donald Trump's false claims of a stolen election in 2020. So places like the Carter Center in Atlanta, founded by former President Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind, train nonpartisan observers to monitor elections in Fulton County, Georgia, in a state that has increasingly become one of the tightest races for Senate. Democrat and pastor Raphael Warnock faces Republican and former football player Herschel Walker in the closely watched race.
Americans themselves are starting to have less faith in elections, less public confidence. And so we view nonpartisan observation as one step among many by different actors, but that we can do as election observers to try to bring more understanding and confidence to election processes.
Elsewhere in Pennsylvania, Democrats have seen early leads evaporate as the Senate race between Democrat Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and celebrity Dr. Mehmet Oz, a Trump-backed Republican, is closer than it has been in months. President Biden told reporters in San Diego he's optimistic about Democrats' chances in this election, but Republicans say they see a clear path to victory.
This is going to be a wake-up call to President Biden, and I hope he answers it, because what's happened over the last 2 years has really caused a lot of problems in America. I hope that President Biden sees what Americans are going to say to him on Tuesday, which is we're not happy, and we need a different agenda. And I think that a Republican-led House and a Republican-led Senate are going to work to deliver on promises made, and I hope Joe Biden listens.
The New York Times reports more than 32 million votes had already been cast as of Thursday, some of which can't be counted until after election night. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
For more insight into the U.S. midterm elections, I'm joined by Steve Reddish, VOA News Center Executive Producer. Steve, welcome back to Africa 54.
Glad to be here.
Definitely very excited about what's likely to happen in the next couple of days, but what's at stake in this election?
Bottom line at stake in this election is control of Congress. Right now, the Democrats control both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate by very, very slim margins in both houses. So in this election, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives, the lower chamber of Congress, and 1/3 of the seats, 35 actually, more than a third, but slightly more than a third of the 100-seat Senate is up for election. And that's going to determine whether or not President Biden is going to be able to get the rest of his agenda through Congress. If one of the chambers falls to the Republicans, it's unlikely he's going to get much accomplished in the last 2 years of his presidency.
But what if it does? What if the Republicans, hold the majority in either the House or the Senate or both? What happens?
If the Republicans hold a majority in either house, you're going to see a lot of investigations of the Biden administration. You're going to certainly see an investigation of the president's son, Hunter Biden, and his business dealings, mostly with Ukraine. And you're going to likely see a lot of programs being held, dare I say, held hostage by Republicans for some concessions from the Biden administration.
So would midterm elections in any way give us a sense of what's likely to happen in the general elections?
Looking forward to 2024, possibly. A lot can happen in the 2 years between the midterms and the next presidential election. But what you're going to see is, I think, you're going to see a very close midterms where both parties are going to just kind of jockey for 1 or 2 seats here and there. It's still going to be a very, very close election.
So where is the competition most stiff for tomorrow's election?
The 3 states to really look at are Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. If whichever party takes 2 of those Senate seats will determine whether or not that party has control of the U.S. Senate.
Steve, you know this stuff. I will get you right back here after the election takes place tomorrow. Steve Reddish is VOA executive producer for VOA News Center. Now, as Americans vote in Tuesday's midterm elections, Zambians are following the elections with a focus on the geopolitical implications and how the outcome of the elections will shape U.S. foreign policy towards Zambia. Daniel Tonga has more from Lusaka, Zambia.
The upcoming midterm elections in the U.S. are telling of how America still exerts influence beyond its borders. Zambians are calling for voters in the U.S. to elect leaders who will improve U.S. foreign policy towards Zambia. Relations between America and Zambia under former president of Zambia, Edgar Lungu, were bumpy on many fronts, including human rights. Hopes are rising in Zambia that the midterm election will usher in leaders who will redefine relations.
We are just hoping as Zambia that, whatsoever the results of the elections, the midterm elections in America, we should be able to have leaders who will be able to not bring the division and the conflict that we saw when they were proposing to establish a base in Zambia. So Zambia is looking forward to the leadership that will respect the sovereignty of this country and the leadership that will be able to engage Zambia and not impose policies that definitely are rejected by the sovereign citizens of this country.
But to some people, the midterm elections will not signal any change in foreign direction, as core principles of human rights, good governance and democracy hardly change in the U.S.
We do not see a Republican midterm Congress outcome in the event that it does come to that. That would all of a sudden prevail over the Biden administration to drop the issues of promotion observance as well as protection of human rights. We don't see that happening too much. So there are certain core foreign policy principles that hardly change depending on which party is in office, and we don't see issues of democracy, good governance and human rights changing at all.
The midterm elections have also become a reminder that Zambia still depends on the U.S. for aid, and more support for Zambia will still be needed.
We want them to continue with the support, especially on us here in Africa, because we are not a monopoly, as a country ourselves, first of all. And we want to tell you that Africa depends on other people, and the U.S. is one of them. We have been in a very good friendship with them, and we want them to go in there and build up, in fact, increase more funding.
America's democracy remains a best model to follow, and concerns over how Democrats and Republicans will shape economic and political issues in the House will be closely followed by Zambians.
We are living in a global village. What is favoring Americans should also favor Africans here. So, which is not happening. We pray that they will elect leaders in parliament that have a focus on Africans, those that will relate very well with Africans, not segregating. This one is not following our policies, not siding with us, then you put them in the corner because they have spoken against the elite Democrats.
The outcome of the midterm election will have a major impact on the remaining years of Joe Biden. But for Zambians, the primary concerns still remain closer to home: the need to redefine U.S. foreign policy and more aid to Africa. Daniel Tonga, VOA News, Lusaka.
As U.S. voters cast their ballots, many candidates of African descent are running for elected office. And joining me now is one such candidate, Adeoye Oye Owolewa, a Nigerian-American and current U.S. shadow representative for the District of Columbia. Oye, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you for having me. It's always good seeing you.
Now look, you are already the current U.S. representative for D.C., and so you're running for a second term. What do you hope to do that you didn't do in this first term that you're already holding?
Thank you for that question. In my second term, we hope to build off of the work we've done. We have raised and amplified the case for DC statehood, not only in DC or even in the United States, but also in African countries as well. We've also successfully introduced a DC statehood resolution in West Virginia and hope to amplify and repeat those efforts in other states as well.
You know, for a long time, Oye, you have advocated for the statehood of the District of Columbia. A lot of people just know DC, but it's not a state. Right. Why would you advocate for this, and what would it mean if DC became a state?
Yeah, DC state is critical because not only do we get to finally have representation on laws that we're taxed to pay for, we're also able to control many things in DC that we currently don't have. Number one, we don't have full control of our law-making system. We don't have control of our criminal justice, and we don't even have control of our budget. So this allows us to have full control over our lives.
So who does have that control over the District of Columbia?
Right now, the federal government controls everything. We have a president that's the chief of our National Guard. So whether it's COVID response or even what happened on January 6th, DC residents were unable to control our own safety.
What other issues are the voters most concerned about in your constituency?
We care about a lot of things. We care about free and fair elections. We care about representation. We also care about how our schools are going to be. And in this office, we're not only just talking the talk, but we're walking it too. So we collaborate with a lot of partners to make sure we give as much value to our residents as possible.
What I hear most here in the District of Columbia after the pandemic is people looking for jobs, people desperate for jobs. What is your plan to get people to work here in DC?
That's a great question. We collaborate with a lot of groups like the Destiny Church of All Nations. We collaborate with chambers of commerce, not only to give people the information, but also opportunities to not only work, but also get grants for their businesses as well. There are a lot of African and minority-owned and women-owned businesses that often aren't represented when it comes to getting those grants and funding to stay afloat.
You saw, we had somebody, a reporter in Zambia, talking about the process and people weighing in on what the U.S. election is all about. But what is innate for Africa when a person of African descent gets elected into office here in the U.S.?
That's a great question. It creates hope. It gives people an opportunity, especially young people. We've collaborated with organizations like NAPAC, the Nigerian American Public Affairs Committee, to really find folks from the diaspora to run for office. We're also collaborating with organizations in Africa, like Yega Africa, to really empower young people to not only see themselves as change leaders, but also run and win elections.
Oh yeah, you're an inspiration. You've made it from Nigeria to the US, and here you are. You're counting hours to the campaign, so we'll let you go. Oye, thank you very much for talking to us, and good luck.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right. Adeoye Oye Owolewa is a Nigerian-American running for re-election as the U.S. Shadow Representative for the District of Columbia. We're excited to hear what you think. As always, we're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, a large hydrocarbon deposit has been discovered off Angola's coast. We'll be back.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
In other news, Angola's National Agency for Oil, Gas and Biofuels says a large hydrocarbon deposit has been discovered off the shore of Luanda at a site operated by American firm ExxonMobil. Rwandan authorities say a fighter jet from the Democratic Republic of Congo violated its airspace Monday, just 48 hours after the neighbors agreed to accelerate efforts to de-escalate tensions. Sudan's military leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, says that talks on a new political framework for the country are being held, but he wants the former ruling party not to interfere with the military or in politics. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.